Section 15 of The Sexes in Science and History by Eliza Burt Gamble. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3, Early Historic Society, Chapter 4, Athenian Women. According to Wilford, the Greeks were the descendants of the Yavanas of India. This writer observes that the Pandits insist that the words Yavana and Yoni are derived from the same root, you, and that when the Ionians emigrated, they adopted this name to distinguish themselves as adorers of the female, in opposition to a strong sect of male worshippers which had been driven from the mother country. Under the constantly increasing importance of the male, however, both in human affairs and in the god idea, they subsequently became ashamed of the religious title and sought to abandon it. Of the aversion felt in Greece for this name, Herodotus says, "The Athenians and most of the Ionic states over the world went so far in their dislike of the name as actually to lay it aside, and even at the present day the greater number of them seems to me to be ashamed of it." Whenever in early historic times a country was subjugated, the conquerors either murdered or enslaved the men and utilized the women for wives or sexual slaves. The Ionians, who according to Herodotus sailed from Attica without women, took for wives native Carians, whose fathers they had slain. Hence these captives made a law which they bound themselves by an oath to observe, and which they handed down to their daughters after them, that none should ever sit at meat with her husband, or call him by his name, because the invaders slew their fathers, their husbands, and their sons, and then forced them to become their wives. The terms of the oaths sworn by them at the time of the capture seem subsequently to have been enforced by their imperious masters. As these women were foreigners, they were entitled to little or no respect from their captors. However, as they were to become the mothers of Greek citizens, they must necessarily be protected, or, in other words, they must be kept in seclusion. In the time of Solon, rape committed on a free-born woman was punishable by fine. From that stage in the history of Greek tribes, at which, through capture and appropriation of the soil by individuals, women began to lose that influence which they had exercised under matriarchal usages, to the time of Solon, the lawgiver of Athens, when they had finally descended to the lowest level of misery and sexual degradation, may be observed a corresponding tendency gradually developing itself among the people towards selfishness, usurpation of power, and the slavery of the masses. In the age of Solon, the limit of human wretchedness seems to have been reached, and as the human race is never at a standstill, it must at this time have either become extinct or have begun gradually to lift itself from the condition of disgrace and ruin into which it had fallen. The character of Solon, as gathered from the facts at hand regarding him, reflects in a measure the true condition of society at that time. Although vain and morally weak, he was in a certain sense humane. His humanity, however, extended only to those of his own sex. A large proportion of the women of Athens were imported foreigners, and were therefore so degraded that they had no rights which anyone, even a lawgiver, was bound to protect. After his appointment to the archonship, Solon's first act was to cancel the debts against the lands and persons of the Athenians, and to establish a law that in future no man should accept the body of his debtor for security. Many who had been previously banished or driven out of the country for debt, and had remained so long from their native land as to forget their Attic dialect, were recalled as free men, while others, who at home had suffered slavery, were released and given their freedom. Perhaps, however, in no position in life will a vain, morally weak man display to better advantage the defects in his character than in his attempts to legislate for women, and under no circumstances will his true inwardness of purpose stand more truly revealed than in his efforts to regulate the relations of the sexes. A brief notice of Solon's laws concerning women proves him to have been no exception to the generally observed rule. It is recorded of him that in his extreme solicitude, lest their movements should not comport with his ideas of female propriety and decorum, he regulated their journeyings and laid down rules respecting their mournings, sacrifices, and the number of gowns which they were to take with them when they went out of town. The provision for their journey, and even the size of the basket in which it was to be conveyed, were subjects not unworthy the attention of the great Athenian lawgiver. Women's mode of travel by night was also prescribed, as was also their conduct at funerals and various places of amusement. In fact, all their actions were subjected to that meddlesome espionage and control which characterize a weak and sensuous age. Indeed, we have something more than a hint of the degraded position occupied by women in the fact that a man might not be allowed to sell a daughter or a sister unless she were taken in an act of dishonor before marriage, in which case her accuser might sell her person for individual gain, and this too notwithstanding the fact that he, as well as nearly every other man in Athens, was steeped in infamy. The measure adopted by Solon for the regulation of prostitution and his division of women into classes for the convenience of all conditions of men indicate clearly the disgrace and shamelessness which characterized the Athenians at this stage of their career, and depict with unerring fidelity the depth of horror into which womanhood had been dragged. The condition of public morals during the 300 years following the age of Solon is plainly indicated not only in the laws but in the mythologies of Greece and Rome. Prostitution was enjoined by religion, and when Draco, suddenly shocked by the degeneracy of his time, affixed the penalty of death to rape, seduction, and adultery, it has been said that by the performance of the prescribed religious rites within the temple the rigor of his edicts was considerably softened. The restraint imposed upon the Athenians by the Draconian regulations was, however, of short duration. For when Solon, the successor of Draco, assumed the position of Archon, he at once legally established a sufficient number of houses of prostitution at Athens to supply the demand, filling them with female slaves who had been taken captives in war, or who had been otherwise provided by the munificence of the government. But you did well for every man, O Solon, for they do say you were the first to see the justice of a public-spirited measure, the savior of the state. By this time, so degraded had womanhood become that the traffic in female captives for sexual purposes was regarded as a legitimate business, and the revenue accruing from their services was considered a lawful source of gain to the state, its use being devoted to the rearing of temples and to the carrying out of the various projects connected with religious worship. That the Athenians of this period were wholly given over to luxury and licentiousness is shown by the fact that at their bacchanalian feasts the troops of women who were in attendance and who had been provided for the occasion by the generosity of the state performed all their duties under direct and explicit instruction of the government to disobey no order of a guest, for which wise regulations Solon received the praise and commendation of Athenian men. In a former portion of this work the fact has been noted that until well into the latter status of barbarism all women were protected, that among the Kaffirs, the Fiji Islanders, and various other peoples occupying a lower stage in the order of growth, women, although divested of their former influence, are still jealously guarded by the gens to which they belong, and that when maidens are bereft of home and near relatives, they are adopted into some other gens within the tribe, where they are invested with the same rights as are its own members. Therefore, when contemplating the social condition of the Athenians 500 or 600 years B.C., we are naturally led to inquire what were the causes which during one ethnical period had produced so marked a change in the position of the female sex. For an answer to our question we must recall the facts set forth in this volume relative to the capture of wives, together with the feeling of hatred entertained by early society for alien women. In the time of Pericles, an age when Athens was at the height of its prosperity, the women of the city were divided into 5 classes as regarded their duties and uses. The first of these consisted of wives who, for the most part, were kept in seclusion and allowed to exist solely for the purpose of propagating Greek citizens. These women were without influence, possessing no rights or privileges beyond the will of their lords, while to such an extent were they considered merely in the light of household furniture that they were not permitted to appear in public, nor to sit at table with their masters. The following dialogue between Socrates and Ischomachus, a man who had managed his household in such a manner as to be pointed out as a model for all Athens, perhaps serves as a correct picture of the relations existing between husband and wife in the Periclean age. "I should like to know this particular from you," said Socrates, "whether you yourself educated your wife so as to make her what she ought to be, or whether you received her from her parents with the knowledge of her duties." "And how could I have received her so educated, Socrates, when she came to me not 15 years old, and had lived up to that time under the strictest surveillance, that she might see as little as possible, and hear as little as possible, and inquire as little as possible?" Of the 5 classes to which reference has been made, wives only were native born, and as this particular class had specific duties to perform, severe penalties were attached to the crimes of seduction and rape when committed upon Athenian women. The remaining 4 classes were arranged according to the dignity of their associates, the highest in rank and repute being the heterae, the members of which comprised the only free women in Athens, themselves philosophers and stateswomen. Their associates among males were of the same rank or station. They constituted a highly intellectual class, and as such were able to control not only their own movements, but to exercise a remarkable influence upon literature, art, and the affairs of state. Because of the important position occupied by these women, they will be referred to later in this work. The next in rank were the Olytrides, or flute players. Many of the most fashionable of these were slaves who had been brought to Greece by speculators. We are informed that female musicians were a usual accompaniment to an Athenian banquet, and that flute playing became an essential feature in the worship of several of their deities. Hence the services of this particular class were in demand, not only to heighten the enjoyment of social intercourse, but to stimulate and encourage religious enthusiasm. At public gatherings, after the dinner was over, and while the wine was flowing freely, these women made their appearance in a semi-nude condition, dancing and keeping time to the music by the graceful motion of their beautifully moulded figures. While the enthusiasm was at its height, they were sold to the highest bidder. Fist fights or hand-to-hand encounters for the possession of these female flute players were not uncommon occurrences in the best society in Athens. These scenes were performed under the sanction of religion and law. They therefore serve to reveal the true inwardness of the Greek character at this stage of development. It is reported that the finest houses in Alexandria were inscribed with the names of famous Greek Olytrides. Of all the flute players of Greece, Lamia is said to have been the most successful. For 15 or 20 years she was the delight of the entire city of Alexandria and of King Ptolemy. Finally, when the city was taken by Demetrius of Macedon, Lamia was taken also. When she demanded that an immense tax be levied on the city of Athens for her benefit, it is recorded that although the people murmured at the amount, they nevertheless found it to their interest to deify her and erect a temple in her honor. According to the testimony of Plutarch, Lamia raised money of her own authority to provide an entertainment for the king. The 4th class consisted of concubines, or purchased slaves who were in the service of Athenian gentlemen. This appendage to the Greek family was a member of the household of her master, where she was kept with the full knowledge of the wife, the latter occupying a position little, if any, superior to that of her rival. Indeed, as the purchased slave could be disposed of whenever the fancy or caprice of her master so dictated, and another installed in her place, it is reasonable to suppose that so long as she did remain, she was the object of quite as much attention as was the wife. The lowest class, or those who were allowed the least freedom of action, were those known as the Dicteriades. They were compelled to reside at a designated place, and were forbidden to be seen upon the streets by day. Nothing of a personal nature was allowed to interfere with the duties which were imposed upon them by their imperious masters. Their only duty was to obey. By this time we are prepared to appreciate to a certain extent the moral aspect of Greek society during the years intervening between the age of Solon and that of Pericles. a period of about a century and a half. That all women, wives, and concubines, native born and foreign, had been dragged to the lowest depths of disgrace and shame, and that they were classified and arranged to meet the demands of those who, through the unchecked tendencies inherent in the male nature, had reached the lowest level of infamy to which it is possible for living creatures to descend, are facts which are only too plainly shown by those whose duty it has been to record the events connected with the history of the Greeks. Although under Draco, the predecessor of Solon, the political degradation of the citizens of Greece may be said to have reached its height, and although the uprising of the masses against the usurpation of power by the few marks an era in the history of the Greeks, it was not until the dawn of the Periclean age that women had gained sufficient freedom to enable them to exercise any direct influence on thought or on the principles underlying human conduct. We must bear in mind the fact that for 5 or 6 centuries the inferiority of women had been systematically and religiously taught. Ever since the rule of Cecrops, at which time doubtless the manner of reckoning descent began to be changed from the female to the male line, women's influence in Athens had gradually declined. The religio-physiological doctrine that in the office of reproduction the mother plays only an insignificant part had not only been proclaimed by Apollo, but had been sanctioned also by Athene. It is recorded of Cecrops that he instituted marriage and established a new religion. Just here may be observed the key to the gradually declining position of the female element in the deity, and to the finally accepted dogma that the female is inferior to the male. Through the private ownership of land and the consequent dependency of women upon men, the way had been paved for this assumption, an assumption which had the effect to create in Ionian men the supreme and lofty contempt for women which is observed throughout their literature and laws. From the age of Solon to that of Pericles, the overwhelming degree of superiority assumed by Athenian men over women had uprooted in the former every vestige of restraint, at the same time that it had deprived them of the last trace of that respect for womanhood which under earlier and more natural conditions had been entertained. It has been frequently remarked that women took little or no part in the intellectual development of Greece, that during the most rapid progress of Greek men there was no corresponding improvement in the position occupied by Greek women. From what is recorded relative to Athenian women from the time of Cecrops to that of Solon, one would scarcely expect to find them competing with men for the prizes of life. Later, however, that a considerable number of them did assert their independence, and that, defying the customs and traditions by which they were bound, did prove themselves the equals of men, may not be doubted. There probably has never been a time since the dominion of man began when the more sensitive and better endowed among women have not secretly rebelled against the tyranny exercised over them, and throughout the ages, whenever an opportunity has been offered, large numbers of these women have never failed to make known their discontent. Greek women were no exception to this rule. Their first step toward liberty was to free themselves from the galling chain imposed upon them by marriage, a position in which, as has been shown, wives were simply household slaves, tools of their imperious and degenerate masters. Greek women in the Periclean age simply assumed the control of their persons, and by so doing provoked the maledictions of future ages, ages in which sensualism still reigned supreme. For reasons which have already been explained, the foremost women in Greece, and in fact all women who during the Periclean age were engaged in art, literature, philosophy, and statesmanship, belonged to the class known as the heterae, a term which through the excessive growth of sensuality and superstition subsequently became a term of reproach. Whatever may have been the importance of the services rendered by these women to society, such services would have been ignored, or, if not altogether ignored, would have been reflected upon or appropriated by the opposite sex. To say that the heterae were free is equal to saying that they have been misunderstood, hence the calumnies which for more than 2000 years have been heaped upon them. that the hetairai of Greece in the Periclean age included a class of women who were the intellectual compeers of the ablest statesmen and philosophers is a fact which may not, by those who have paid close attention to the subject, be denied. That they taught rhetoric and elocution, that they lectured publicly and established schools of philosophy at the same time that they yielded a powerful influence on the state and on the drift of current thought, are facts which medieval scholasticism has not been able to conceal. I think one may not investigate the various schools of philosophy which arose during the 4th and 5th centuries B.C. without noting the peculiarly altruistic principles involved in them, and this too notwithstanding the fact that hitherto extreme selfishness or egoism had constituted the prevailing character observed in Athenian society. According to the principles of the Cyrenaics, the virtuous man is not necessarily he who is in the possession of pleasure, but he who is able to proceed rightly in quest of pleasure. Virtue is the only possible and sane way to happiness. The most eminent members of the Cyrenaics were Areta, the daughter of Aristippus, and her son Aristippus the younger, surnamed the Mother Taught. The fundamental doctrine of the Cyrenes seems to have been that right living or virtue constitutes the only good. The essence of virtue lies in self-control. Enjoyment sought as an end is evil. Virtue is capable of being taught, and when once acquired cannot be lost. What is good is honorable, and what is bad is disgraceful. On examination it is found that one of the most eminent members of this school is Hipparchia. That she is not a mere listener imbibing the ideas of others is shown in the fact that she lectured publicly and argued strongly before the philosophers of Athens. The founder of the Cynic school of philosophy is said to have been Antisthenes, the son of a Thracian mother. One of the sayings of this philosopher is that virtue is the same in a man as in a woman. That the question of the position of women was a theme for discussion in the age under consideration is shown in a sophism proposed by Hipparchia to Theodorus. Once, when she went to sup with Lysimachus, she said to Theodorus, "What Theodorus could not be called wrong for doing, that same thing Hipparchia ought not to be called wrong for doing." When we take into consideration the fact that Hipparchia was intimately associated with Crates, a man for whom she entertained the tenderest affection, and when we remember that they were both engaged in teaching a philosophy which recognized virtue as the supreme end of life, the conversation at the house of Lysimachus between Hipparchia and Theodorus, as set forth by Diogenes Laertius, will be seen to admit of a different interpretation than that which commonly prevails. Of the Epicureans it has been observed that they were a sort of Pythagorean brotherhood consisting of both men and women. The scandalous tongue of antiquity was never more virulent than it was in the case of Epicurus, but, as far as we can judge, the life of the garden joined to urbanity and refinement a simplicity which would have done no discredit to a Stoic. Indeed, the Stoic Seneca continually refers to Epicurus not less as a model for conduct than as a master of sententious wisdom. Among the most distinguished members of this school were Themistia, to whom Cicero refers in his speech against Pisa as a sort of female Solon, and Leontium, who ventured to attack Theophrastus in an essay characterized, as we are assured, by much elegance of style. No school of philosophy arose in Athens with which there was not closely connected the name of one or another of the illustrious women of the time. Zeno, the founder of the Stoic philosophy, was the pupil of Crates, the companion of Hipparchia. Aspasia was the clever preceptress of Socrates, the sage who sat for the portrait of the Stoic philosophy. According to the Stoic philosophy, the supreme end of life is virtue, that is, a life conformed to nature. The degree of self-restraint taught by Socrates is shown in the following lines. Is it not the duty of every man to consider that temperance is the foundation of every virtue, and to establish the observance of it in his mind before all things? For who without it can either learn anything good or sufficiently practice it? Who that is a slave to pleasure is not in an ill condition both as to his body and his mind? It appears to me by Juno that a free man ought to pray that he may never meet with a slave of such a character, and that he who is a slave to pleasure should pray to the gods that he may find well-disposed masters, for by such means only can a man of that sort be saved. When the ablest statesmen and the first philosophers of Greece united in sounding the praises of Alcibiades, the genius of Aspasia commanded equal recognition. Not only did Socrates and Pericles receive instruction and inspiration from this gifted woman, but we are assured that she lectured publicly and that her acquaintances took their wives with them to hear her discourse. Indeed, Pericles threw all Greece into confusion on account of Aspasia, not the young one, but that one who associated with the wise Socrates. It is not to be imagined that Aspasia excelled in light and amorous discourses. Her discourses, on the contrary, were not more brilliant than solid. It was believed by the most intelligent Athenians, and amongst them Socrates himself, that she composed the celebrated funeral oration pronounced by Pericles in honor of those that were slain in the Samian war. It is recorded of her that many Athenians resorted to her lecture room on account of her skill in the art of speaking. Not only did she teach rhetoric, philosophy, and the proper relations of the sexes, but so renowned was she for statesmanship that Pericles is said to have surrendered to her the government of Athens, then at the height of its glory and renown. On this subject Plutarch remarks: "Some indeed say that Pericles made his court to Aspasia only on account of her wisdom and political abilities. It has been said that the expedition against the Samians was merely to gratify Aspasia. The Milesians and Samians who had been at war were ordered to lay down their arms. When they refused to obey, Pericles, in company with Aspasia, sailed with a fleet to Samos, and abolished the oligarchical form of government. Although he was offered large sums of money, he treated the Samians in the manner he had resolved on, and having established a popular government in the island, he returned to Athens." Plutarch, quoting from Aeschines, says that Lysicles, who was of a mean, ungenerous disposition, by his intercourse with Aspasia after the death of Pericles, became the most considerable man in Athens. Notwithstanding the scandalous reports which have come down to us of this woman's character, in view of the facts which it has been impossible for sex prejudice to conceal, we are constrained to ask, what manner of woman was this who was able to control statesmen, impart instruction to world-renowned philosophers, and leave a name which even bigotry, envy, and malice may not efface from the history of human events? In seeking for an explanation of the exalted character of Aspasia, we have something more than a hint in the fact that she is reported to have trod in the steps of Thargelia, a woman who by her exceeding brilliancy had gained the sovereignty of Thessaly. Indeed, we have found a key to the entire situation when we learn that this Thargelia, in whose steps Aspasia trod, was descended from the ancient Ionians, a people who originally worshipped the female principle, and who still preserve the customs peculiar to the matriarchal system, under which, it will be remembered, women as aliens did not follow the fathers of their children to their homes. So soon as these facts are understood, we are not in the least surprised to learn that Aspasia discountenanced the institution of marriage as it existed in Athens. Neither is it remarkable when we remember that the underlying principles involved in the philosophy which she taught were justice and equity, that she should be found using her great influence, as in the case of the Milesians and Samians, in substituting democracies in the place of oligarchies, nor that in an age when women had come to be regarded simply as the tools and slaves of men, she should be found teaching the dignity of womanhood to her own sex and the principles of equality to males. According to Xenophon, Aspasia's efforts were to a great extent directed to the duties of husbands and wives. Indeed, her foremost object seems to have been to educate Athenian women. During the Periclean age, the position of women was one of the leading topics discussed in Athens. Socrates says to his companions that he has been of the opinion of a long time that the female sex are nothing inferior to ours, excepting only in strength of body or perhaps steadiness of judgment. The coarse picture painted by Aristophanes of women with beards going in male attire to the agora to seize the administration of the state so as to do the state some good, although a vulgar attempt to ridicule the female philosophers of Athens, furnishes something more than a hint of the fact that the ideas subsequently set forth in Plato's Republic had been openly discussed by the philosopher of the Periclean age. That the word hetere was originally employed in no mean or compromising sense is plain, since Sappho uses it in the sense of female companion, hetera, of the same rank and the same interests. We are assured that these women were able to perceive a friendship free from trickery. Of them even Xenoclus does not venture to speak ill. They, of all women, are the only ones who are derived their names from friendship or from that goddess who is named by the Athenians Venus Hetera. Accordingly, even to this day, observes Athenius, free-born women and maidens call their associates and friends their hetera, as Sappho does, where she says, "And now with tuneful voice I'll sing these pleasing songs to my companions." And in another place she says, "Niobe and Latona were of old affectionate companions hetera to each other." That medieval scholasticism has not been able wholly to obscure the greatness of the Greek hetera is shown by the declaration of a renowned writer of modern times who says, "Of all the poets who have appeared on the earth, Sappho was undoubtedly the greatest." Notwithstanding the aspersions which have been cast upon the name and fame of the heterae of Greece, it is doubtful if the intelligent women of the present age, who carefully examine the shreds and remnants concerning them which have withstood the envy of mediocrity and the bigotry of scholasticism, will be brought to believe that the excesses which are foreign to the female nature, and which belong to ruder and less highly developed structures, were practiced by these gifted women. We must bear in mind that the heterae were free, and therefore that they were able to direct their movements according to the natural characters developed within the female, characters which, it will be remembered, are correlated with the maternal instinct. The licentiousness not only of Greek and Roman women, but of those in certain portions of Asia as well, has been the favorite theme of many writers of past ages. More especially has the lewdness of Lydian and Babylonian women been noted and commented upon. After referring to the annual sale of women in Babylonia, Herodotus says that the people have lately hit upon a very different plan to save their maidens from violence and prevent their being torn from them and carried to distant cities, which is to bring up their daughters to be courtesans. This is now done by all the poorer of the common people, who since the conquest have been maltreated by their lords and have had ruin brought upon their families. It is recorded that the various classes of kept women in Greece were foreigners, that they were either brought or captured from surrounding countries. As in the case of the Lydians and Babylonians, they were doubtless carried from their homes at a tender age, after having been reared to their profession. Many of the maidens thus taken to Greece subsequently became philosophers, statesmen, and scholars, whereupon they abandoned their former calling. Lysias mentions the fact that Philyra gave up her former course when she was still quite young, and so did Sione, and Hippophysis, and Theoclea, and Psamathe, and Lagisca, and Antheia. As special mention is made of a woman who did not cease to live a prostitute when she began to learn philosophy, we may reasonably infer that it was usual for these women to abandon the calling to which they had been born and bred, so soon as, from such teachers as Aspasia and Hipparchia, they began to imbibe principles of self-respect and womanly independence. From the position occupied by the heterae, it is evident that by the philosophers of Greece they were regarded with that respect which is ever due to cultured womanhood. Indeed, from the evidence at hand, we may believe that they were the most highly honored citizens in Athens. All women in Greece who prostituted themselves were forbidden to take sacred names. Yet of Nemeas, Athenius says, "And we may wonder how it was that the Athenians permitted a courtesan to have such a name, which was that of a most honorable and solemn festival." Of Glycera it is related that Harpalus issued an edict that no one should present him with a crown unless the donor at the same time presented one to her. He erected a statue to her and permitted her to dwell in the palace of Tarsus, where he allowed her to receive adoration from the people. he permitted her also to bear the title of queen, and to be complimented with other presents which are only fit for your own mother and your own wife. Timotheus, who was a general of very high repute in the Athenian army, was the son of a courtesan. We are informed, however, that she was a courtesan of very excellent character. The great Themistocles is said to have been the son of Abrotonum, a courtesan. It is recorded that in response to an order issued by the people, Praxiteles made a solid gold statue of one of the heterae, which was consecrated in the temple of Delphi. Certainly the deathless models of Greek art formed by Praxiteles and Phidias are not representations of coarse and sensualized womanhood. That these women were a power in Athens during the Periclean age may not, in view of the facts recorded in relation to them, be disputed. Of them it has been said, "None but they could gather round them of an evening the choicest spirits of the day, and elicit in the freedom of unrestrained intercourse wit and wisdom, flashing fancy and burning eloquence." What wonder that the heterae should have filled so prominent a part in Greek society, and how small a compensation to virtuous women to know their rivals could not stand at the altar when sacrifice was offered, could not give birth to a citizen. In this acknowledgment of the exalted position occupied by the Greek heterae, the author, like most writers upon the subject of the sexual relations, measures virtue not by its antithesis to vice, but by the established masculine standards which have been set up for women to conform to. A Greek wife's life may have been one continuous scene of subjection to the lowest appetites of a master for whom she may have had not the least degree of respect or affection, and who regarded her only in the light of an instrument for his convenience and pleasure. Still such a one would doubtless be accounted as a virtuous woman, in contradistinction to one of the heterae whose position enabled her to control her own person, and who was able to exercise her own will power in protecting it against the excesses of Greek men. It is evident that this class of women, more than any other in Greece, was able to direct its movements and manage its activities, and therefore, if we bear in mind the characters correlated in the female constitution with the maternal instinct, we may be assured that among the entire population of Athens the lives of these women were the most pure and the least addicted to excesses. Aspasia, the philosopher and statesman. Hipparchia, practical professor of Cynic philosophy and one of the most voluminous and esteemed writers of her time. Thargelia, the Milesian, whose Xerxes employed at the court of Thessaly, and many others scarcely less renowned, prove that through the exercise of that personal freedom enjoyed by the heterae, women had at length risen to that position in which they were able to exert a powerful influence, not only on the affairs of state, but upon the intellectual development of the Athenians and the entire world. To say that these women have been written about in an age in which male power and male influence have been in the ascendancy is to say that they have been misunderstood and their movements misinterpreted. Because of the efforts put forth by scholastics for 2000 years to belittle or annul the importance of the services rendered by the heterae, they will doubtless for some time continue to be judged not by their intellectual vigor, nor by what they accomplished, but by the social position into which, through the exigencies of masculine domination, they had been jostled. The fact has been observed that less than 2 centuries prior to the age of Aspasia and Socrates, Solon had given to the calling of prostitution the sanction of religion and law, that he had purchased a sufficient number of young slaves from surrounding countries to satisfy the demands of the men of Greece, and that he had made the calling of these girls a source of public revenue, for which services he had received the title of savior of the state. We would scarcely expect, therefore, to find chastity among the prominent virtues of the Periclean age. I wish to emphasize the fact that, by the conditions of society at that time, the class designated as heterae, although they were in a certain sense free, were practically prevented, no matter what may have been their natural inclinations or aspirations, from rising to a higher plane of moral action, and furthermore that the existing conditions were wholly the result of the supremacy gained by the lower propensities over the higher forces developed in human nature. Had these gifted women accepted the position of wife, ignorance and seclusion would have been their portion, while their sexual degradation would have been none the less complete or perfect. Indeed, it would have been all the more intolerable for the reason that the degradation of their persons which in the position of hetero was sued for as a privilege in the position of wife, would have been claimed as a right. By most writers upon this subject the fact seems to have been overlooked, or, if observed, has not been acknowledged, that licentiousness among women during a certain period of Greek life, about which so much has been written, was governed wholly by the demands of their masters. In fact, throughout the history of mankind, since the ascendancy of the male over the female has been gained, the class which has controlled the means of support, and within which was resided all the power to direct the activities of women, has ever regulated the supply of victims to be offered upon the altar of lust. And in all these regulations may be observed such an adjustment of women's duties to the necessities of the male nature, that no alternative has been left them but submission. End of section 15. Section 16 of the Sexes in Science and History by Eliza Burt Gamble. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3, Early Historic Society, Chapter 5, Roman Law, Roman Women, and Christianity. The far-reaching results of the various schools of philosophy which rose in Greece during the Periclean age will be noted in this chapter. That the principles involved in this philosophy may not have been formulated by the heterae of Athens is doubtless true, yet that the inception and development of these principles were largely due to the freedom of these gifted women seems probable, especially when we remember the conditions under which this philosophy arose. A glance at the principles involved in the Stoic philosophy will show its thoroughly altruistic character. The sum of its tenets was to live according to nature's laws, to subordinate one's self to the welfare of one's family, one's country, and the entire race, and to rise above the gross indulgences and pleasures of the vulgar, to higher laws of thought and action. It taught that to be just, and to live according to the dictates of reason rather than to be governed by the promptings of blind passion and the desire of the appetites, should be not only the duty, but the highest pleasure of mankind. Possibly some of the minor precepts of the Stoic philosophy were absurd. No doubt, in their desire for reform, its founders set up a canon of conduct which was severe and impracticable. But its fundamental principles, the subjection of the animal in man to the reasoning faculties, as applied to future Roman law, Roman civilization, and Roman character, served to produce specimens of manhood which the women of all subsequent ages should delight to honor. So long as virtue is applauded and moral greatness is exalted, the enactments of the Roman jurisconsults in the interest of women, prior to and during the time of the Antonine Caesars, will stand forth throughout the ages as the one single movement during thousands of years toward the removal of the legal disabilities of women. When we remember that the Stoic philosophy took root and flourished during an age of unparalleled profligacy, which was stimulated and encouraged by the example of the most opulent and luxurious personages among the Greeks, and at a time when licentiousness had for centuries been sanctioned by religion and upheld by laws made by the men of Greece, it is quite evident that some potent influence, which had hitherto been unfelt, had been in operation to produce it. In order to understand the influence which the Stoic philosophy exerted on civilization, and especially on the legal position of women, we must first understand its effect upon Roman law. An inquiry into the changes which had been wrought in Roman jurisprudence at the time of the Antonine Caesars, by engrafting upon it the underlying principles contained in the Stoic philosophy, discloses the fact that the emancipation of women had been practically accomplished in Rome. Perhaps there is no subject which at the present time possesses greater interest for inquiring women than that concerning the status of their sex under the older Roman law. For, by an understanding of women's legal status, as fixed under this institution at a time when man had gained the summit of his power over her, is furnished a key whereby may be unlocked many of the mysteries surrounding the still extant social and legal disabilities of women. The thoroughly egoistic character of the principles underlying the older Roman law has been noticed in a former portion of this work. We have seen that in Rome the father, who who was the sole representative of the family, had drawn to himself not only all the authority over the child which under the earlier Gentile organization of society had been acknowledged as belonging exclusively to the mother, but, ignoring individual liberty and all the principles of personal freedom which had been established under the matriarchal system, had proclaimed himself absolute sovereign over all within the agnatic bond. The divine oracle of Apollo, which had enunciated the doctrine that the soul of the child is derived from the father, had at the same time declared that the mother has to do only with furnishing the body. Thus the father, as creator, became the household god, his authority, as we have seen, being supreme even to the exercise of the power of life and death over its members. Under ancient law, the father, as head of the household, really constituted the family, the remaining members being merely ciphers which, from the peculiar position in which they were placed, were without significance except as vassals under the strictest tutelage of their master. Under this august system of father worship, males as well as females had become enslaved. The bondage of men, however, differed somewhat from the perpetual tutelage of women, in the fact that they themselves in time might become heads of families, and in that imperial position to assume the same authority and dominion over others as had been exercised over them. Women, however, could never become heads of families, and therefore could never hope to be free. So long as they remained single, they were under the tutelage of their blood relations, or were subject to the authority of some individual whom the father, before his death, might choose to appoint over them as guardian. Thus arose the law known as the perpetual tutelage of women. Upon this subject Sir Henry Maine says, "Ancient law subordinates the woman to her blood relations, while a prime phenomenon of modern jurisprudence has been her subordination to her husband. The history of the change is remarkable. It begins far back in the annals of Rome. Anciently, there were three modes in which marriage might be contracted according to Roman usage, one involving a religious solemnity, the other two, the observance of certain secular formalities. By the religious marriage of confarreation, by the higher form of civil marriage, which was called coemption, and by the lower form, which was termed usus, the husband acquired a number of rights over the person and property of his wife, which were on the whole in excess of such as are conferred on him in any system of modern jurisprudence. But in what capacity did he acquire them? Not as husband, but as father. By the confarreation, coemption, and usus, the woman passed in manum viri, that is, in law she became the daughter of her husband. She was included in his patria potestas. She incurred all the liabilities springing out of it while it subsisted, and surviving it when it had expired. All her property became absolutely his, and she was retained in tutelage after his death to the guardian whom he had appointed by will." On this subject of male supremacy in the family, Mr. Maine remarks, "The foundation of agnation is not the marriage of father and mother, but the authority of the father. All persons are agnatically bound together who are under the same paternal power, or who have been under it, or who might have been under it, if their lineal ancestor had lived long enough to exercise his empire. Under this bond would be united all the children belonging to the head of the household, and all the descendants of the sons, but not all the daughters. The daughters' children, under this manner of reckoning descent, belong to the families of their respective fathers. Although under this system a man might adopt a stranger into his family and invest him with all the rights and privileges appertaining thereunto, no descendant of a daughter could claim any of the rights of agnation. Under Hindu law, which is saturated with the primitive notions of family dependency, in the genealogies the names of women are omitted altogether. We are assured by Mr. Maine that the exclusion of women from governmental functions certainly had its origin in agnation. Thus it is seen that paternity had come to involve the idea of a supreme ruler or potentate, and that the overshadowing predominance of the male over the female had paved the way to the future worship of one all-powerful male deity. We have seen that the principles involved in the Stoic philosophy were justice, equality, and the subjection of the appetites to the dictates of reason and conscience. So soon as Greece was subjugated by Rome, the ablest of the Romans espoused the principles embodied in this philosophy, and notably, among those who became interested in its tenets were the Roman lawyers, who began immediately to reconstruct the civil law upon the principles underlying this system. That it is only through a return to the archaic and natural principles of justice and right living, the acknowledgment of which at once establishes the proper relations of the sexes, that women may ever hope to be free, is plain to all those who have given attention to this subject. This fact was evidently observed by the Roman lawyers who, through the persistency with which only those labor who are engaged in establishing a principle, had so far succeeded in overcoming the prejudice against sex as to have established a legal code wherein was practically recognized the equality of women with men. Doubtless the Romans were as tenacious of their ancient customs, prejudices, and long-established privileges as have been the people of any other country. Hence, we may perhaps form a faint idea of the obstacles which presented themselves, and of the devices which must have been resorted to by Roman jurists in an endeavor to remove the existing legal restrictions upon the liberties of women. Mr. Main informs us that Gaius, a celebrated jurist who lived in the age of the Antonine Caesars, devoted an entire volume to descriptions of the ingenious expedients devised by Roman lawyers to evade the letter of the ancient law, and that it was through this source that the fact finally became known that in the age of the Antonine Caesars the legal disabilities of women had been practically annulled. From the facts at hand it is observed that the object of the Roman lawyers was to frame an edictal jurisprudence which should supersede the older law, or which in effect should annul its power. We are informed that the praetor was not only the chief equity judge, but that he was also the common law magistrate. So soon, therefore, as the edict had passed through the necessary formalities enabling it to become a law, the praetor's court began to apply it in place, or by the side of the civil law, which was directly or indirectly repealed without any express enactment of legislation. In reference to the legal status of women in the age of the Antonine Caesars, Henry Main observes, led by their theory of natural law, the jurisconsults had at this time assumed the equality of the sexes as a principle of their code of equity. Although the seed sown in Greece during the Periclean age, when conveyed to Rome, produced a golden harvest, the fact will doubtless be remembered that the Roman lawyers had but just completed their work of establishing the legal equality of the sexes, when the agencies which for years had been at work to destroy the empire culminated. And finally, when Christianity, in the person of Constantine, ascended the throne, the results of 4 centuries of civilization were destroyed, or for more than 1600 years were practically annulled. Regarding the changes which had been wrought in the legal status of women in the age of the Antonine Caesars, we are informed that whereas under the older Roman law a woman at marriage came under the patria potestas of her husband, under the later law, as influenced by the principles involved in the Stoic philosophy, she remained as a member of her own family, or was placed under the protection of a guardian appointed by her parents, whose jurisdiction over her, although superior to that of her husband, was not such as to interfere with her personal liberty. Thus, the same as under matriarchal usages, the situation of the Roman woman, whether married or single, was one of great influence. Of this freedom exercised by women in the time of the Antonine Caesars, Mr. Main remarks. But Christianity tended somewhat from the very first to narrow this remarkable liberty. The latest Roman law, so far as it is touched by the constitutions of the Christian emperors, bears some marks of a reaction against the liberal doctrines of the great Antonine jurisconsults, and the prevalent state of religious sentiment may explain why it is that modern jurisprudence, forged in the furnace of barbarian conquest, and formed by the fusion of Roman jurisprudence with patriarchal usages, has absorbed among its rudiments much more than usual of those rules concerning the position of women which belong peculiarly to an imperfect civilization. Concerning the influence of ecclesiasticism on that portion of Roman jurisprudence relating particularly to women, Mr. Lecky observes, Wherever the canon law has been the basis of legislation, we find laws of succession sacrificing the interests of daughters and of wives, and a state of public opinion which has been formulated and regulated by these laws. By means of a formulated ecclesiastical jurisprudence, the complete inferiority of the sex was maintained, and that generous public opinion, which in Rome had frequently rebelled against the injustice done to girls in depriving them of the greater portion of the inheritance of their fathers, totally disappeared. In comparing the Roman law with the canon or ecclesiastical code, the same writer says that the pagan laws during the empire were constantly repealing the old disabilities of women, but that it was the aim of the canon law to substitute enactments which should entail on the female sex the greatest personal restrictions and the most stringent subordination. Those who have paid attention to the history of the English common law, which forms the basis of our present system of jurisprudence, and who have noted the part played by ecclesiasticism in fixing the status of women therein, will not be surprised at the attitude which the so-called Christian Church has assumed toward women. Referring to the common law, an able writer has said, "This imperishable specimen of human sagacity is, strange to say, so grossly unjust toward women that a great writer upon that code has well observed that in it women are regarded not as persons, but as things. So completely were they stripped of all their rights and held in subjection to their proud and imperious masters." It has been remarked that in no one particular does the canon law depart so widely from the spirit of secular jurisprudence as in the view it takes of the relations created by marriage. Although the leaven of civilization preserved from Roman institutions was the codified jurisprudence of Justinian, as the chapter of law relating to women was read by the light of canon law, the altruistic principles which had characterized the late Roman code soon became extinct. Upon this subject Mr. Main remarks, "This was in part inevitable, since no society which preserves any tincture of Christian institutions is likely to restore to married women the personal liberty conferred on them by the Middle Roman law. And this is doubtless true for the reason that the entire Christian superstructure rests on the dogma of female weakness and female depravity. The doctrine of original sin, which depends entirely on the story of the fruit tree of Genesis being taken in a literal sense, had by canonists been accepted. On her first appearance upon the scene of action, woman is laboring under a curse pronounced upon her by an all-powerful male god for the mischief she had wrought on innocent man. It is only reasonable, therefore, that human law should unite with the divine decree in establishing her complete and final degradation. Hence the return to the ancient Hindu law and the older Roman code for models of legislation concerning her. On this subject Mr. Main remarks, "I do not know how the operation and nature of the ancient patria potestas can be brought so vividly before the mind as by reflecting on the prerogatives attached to the husband by the pure English common law, and by recalling the rigorous consistency with which the view of a complete legal subjection on the part of the wife is carried by it, where it is untouched by equity or statutes, through every department of rights, duties, and remedies." Note, as the position of women among the early German hordes was one of great dignity and respect, it may scarcely be argued that the sentiments embodied in the English common law relative to wives were in any degree the result of innate Teutonic prejudice against the female sex. End of note. Notwithstanding the efforts which for several centuries were put forth in Rome to secure to women that independence which under the earlier Roman law had been denied them, in the Code of Justinian, which was compiled in the early part of the 6th century, no word respecting the remarkable degree of liberty which under the later Roman law was accorded to women appears, and, but for the discovery of the manuscript of Gaius, to which reference has already been made, we would never have become acquainted with the changes which had been wrought in this particular branch of Roman jurisprudence. In the Justinian Code, instead of the humane edicts of the later or Middle Roman law, appeared the canon or ecclesiastical law, by means of which women were condemned to a state of servitude even more degrading than that which had been imposed on them by the older law. Had medieval scholasticism succeeded in concealing from the world the information contained in the manuscript of Gaius, still there would have remained sufficient evidence left to prove that in the 2nd century of the present era woman's freedom had been practically won. That women themselves were claiming absolute legal equality with men may not be doubted. Honoria, a Roman matron, first enunciated the principle: taxation without representation is tyranny. Cato's celebrated oration, in which he passionately exclaims, "If you allow your women to be your equals, how long will it be before they become your superiors?" shows that a certain type of men were becoming alarmed over the growing independence of women. The freeing of women from the bondage entailed on them by the older Roman law, an achievement which had required more than 3 centuries to accomplish, was a triumph for civilization unparalleled during the historic period. That this triumph over tyranny was of short duration is shown in the sequel of this movement. That the coming of Jesus at a time when the principles of justice and equality were becoming the recognized rule of life among the better class of Romans is not surprising. No one may study Greek philosophy without noting the similarity between it and the teachings of Christ. Justice, self-restraint, and regard for the rights and feelings of others, principles which when applied to Roman law had liberated women from the tyranny of the past, were also the principles taught by Jesus. It seems to have been the mission of the latter to convey these lofty doctrines to the multitude. "Do unto others as you would have others do unto you," was not however understood by the masses, who knew no other rule of life than that of selfishness and ungoverned lust. Hence, in process of time, the new movement came to have no other effect than to add to the already established evils another quite as contemptible, namely, hypocrisy. Among the earliest Christians, theological disputes were unknown. Original sin and the doctrine of a vicarious atonement whereby a man is saved, not from sin but from the penalty for sin, were unheard of. To spread the simple principles enunciated by Jesus, and by so doing to kindle into life the divine spark in man, seem to have constituted the object and aim of the earliest Christians. The activities necessary for the propagation of these principles were shared alike by both sexes. Women exhorted, prophesied, and prayed in the churches. They baptized their own sex. One of them wrote a gospel which, so long as woman's influence continued, was in use among the Christians. Such were the conditions when Paul, a Jew who had espoused the new religion, first appeared on the scene. An extant legend describes this man as small in stature and of ignoble bearing. According to this legend, Paul was bald-headed and bow-legged. As to his intellectual ability, we have the following Corinthians 10:10. For his letters, they were weighty and strong, but his speech is of no account. It is elsewhere recorded of him that his speech was contemptible. From what is known of this man Paul, it is evident that he was domineering, self-sufficient, and aggressive. He quarreled with Peter and was intolerant of the ideas of his associates. His forceful character, his untiring energy, his zeal for the cause which had espoused, and above all his capacity for organization, soon gained for him the leadership of the new movement. Nowhere it is recorded that during the earlier years of Paul's Christian career he attempted to discourage or curtail the activities of women. On the contrary, he refers to them as co-workers, acknowledges them as prophets, and praises their ministrations. In his writings the name of Priscilla occurs many times. Phoebe, Claudia, Julia, and others are regarded as worthy of mention by him. As his influence and power increased, however, his egoism began to assert itself. It is evident that Paul's strong masculine nature could no longer tolerate a religion which might, with some degree of consistency, be regarded as a feminine movement. The old doctrine enunciated by Apollo during the reign of Cecrops, namely that man is a divine emanation while woman is only human, must be revived. The following from Paul's writings shows that his aim was to crush the influence and power exercised by women, and the means employed was to subject them to the dominion of their husbands. The head of every man is Christ, and the head of every woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. For the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience. And if they would learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home. That women were no longer to be the equals and companions of their husbands, but that they were to become sexual slaves, is indicated by the command, "Wives, subject yourself unto your husbands." It must be remembered that these commands of Paul were not, as have been frequently asserted, delivered to and about weak, ignorant women devoid of influence, but were directed against those whose position of equality in the new religion had not before been questioned, and whose legal disabilities had at that time been well nigh removed. Before the close of the 2nd century, the simple ethical teachings of Jesus were forgotten. Christianity had disappeared and Paulism had taken its place. A century later, after the empire had come under the control of so-called Christian rule, woman's influence, as we have already seen, entirely disappeared. All that had been gained by means of the Middle Roman law had been annulled by the decrees of the canon law. Pauline Christianity, in the 4th century B.C., was an attempt to re-establish that form of paganism which had prevailed prior to the rise of Greek philosophy. This older religion, which had its origin in sun worship, or in the worship of the two fecundating principles throughout nature, had, as early as the Periclean age, ceased to claim the attention of the educated classes among the Greeks. Aeschylus barely escaped being stoned to death for heresy, and, as is well known, Socrates, the founder of the Stoic philosophy, was forced to drink of the fatal cup because of his unbelief in the prevailing superstitions. Not to destroy paganism itself, but to exterminate the last vestige of Greek philosophy, was the task which the Pauline Christians had set themselves to perform. Jesus now became the new solar deity, and all the forms observed under the older paganism were now attached to his worship. He was born at the winter solstice, or at the time when the sun had reached its zenith and was about to return. He died and was buried, but at the vernal equinox, Easter, the time at which all nature is revived. He arose from the dead and became the Saviour of mankind. The entire Christian calendar is copied from the ancient pagan worship. A medal was struck, on which appeared the figure of a man on a cross, on the observed side of which was a representation of a blazing sun. Christ was the new Sun of righteousness, the giver and preserver of life. Every page in the history of the Pauline religion reveals its masculine origin. The deities worshipped are a father and a son. All the angels and archangels are men. All extant gospels and epistles have been written and expounded by men. It is true that in response to a popular demand in the 5th century for recognition of the female principle, the Virgin Mary, an ancient deity, reappeared. The lateness of her coming, however, shows that she was an afterthought. Moreover, it must be borne in mind that, true to the ancient doctrine which was revived by Paul relative to the divinity of man and the material nature of woman, the mother of Jesus was human, while the Father and the Son were divine. She was matter, they were spirit. Among the discussions of the early Pauline fathers, none was more important than this. Ought women to be allowed to learn the alphabet? And has woman a soul? It is recorded that a few of these pious leaders entertained the opinion that because of the great power and goodness of the Almighty, women may possibly be permitted to rise as men at the resurrection. As we have seen, to destroy Greek philosophy was the slogan of the new movement. The destruction of the Alexandrian library by a fanatical mob led by Archbishop Theophilus is an example of the fury with which all institutions not directly connected with the new religion were attacked. As is well known, this library contained the accumulated knowledge of a highly civilized people extending over a period of several thousands of years. Among the priceless treasures stored in this library were the records of astronomical observations scientifically registered during a period of not less than 3,000 years. The lectures delivered by Hypatia in Alexandria during the latter part of the 4th century were the last attempt made to stem the tide of fanaticism which was destined to sweep over a large portion of the habitable globe. The fate of Hypatia, who was foully murdered by a mob led by Saint Cyril, was a forecast of the fate which awaited any and all who should henceforth dare to think or act independently of the new religion. When Greek philosophy was no longer taught, the principles of equality and liberty which had been incorporated into the Middle Roman law were annulled or practically forgotten, and when the doctrine of woman's inferiority and total depravity became crystallized not only in religion but in law and in all the customs of the time, women sank to a degree of degradation never before witnessed in the history of mankind. End of section 16. Section 17 of the Sexes in Science and History by Eliza Burt Gamble. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3. Early Historic Society. Chapter 6. The Renaissance. If the theory that the higher faculties and the moral sense originated in the female, and that these qualities are by her transmitted to offspring, then the conditions existing in the first half of the 16th century are easily explained. Or, if, as is clearly proven by the facts brought out by scientists, woman represents the constructive and combining element in human society, without which organized society would have been impossible, the degeneracy observed after 1300 years, during which time women were wholly without influence and power, is exactly what might be expected. Indeed, it is not singular that with the disintegrating or destructive forces in command over the conserving or the constructive elements, that war and religion should have become the business of the world, and that a state of society should have prevailed which was in strict accord with these conditions. However, that the constructive element was not dead is shown by the mental and moral unrest which began to manifest itself in the latter half of the 16th century. Women began to learn the alphabet, and in a weak way to demand concessions hitherto denied them. Many men of genius who, like the jurisconsults of Rome, had not been submerged by the degeneracy of their time, defied the persecutors and secretly promulgated the scientific theories which were to revolutionize human thought. The demand for freedom of conscience and for the release of the intellect and reason from the domination of bigotry and superstition constituted one of the first steps toward reform. Galileo, Bruno, Copernicus, and Harvey are notable examples of the revolt against the intellectual tyranny which prevailed. It is not a little singular that at this time the throne of England was occupied by a woman, and that her reign should have been the most brilliant that that country has ever enjoyed. It has frequently been said that the success of Elizabeth's reign was due not to her greatness, but to that of the statesmen whom she called about her. But even were this true, which it is not, it would not detract from her greatness. The innate qualities developed within Queen Elizabeth, namely genius and intuition, can alone explain the brilliancy of her reign. It is to be doubted if the progressive principle has ever been wholly dead. That even during the darkest period of the Middle Ages the constructive element was still alive in Europe is shown in the fact that, as early as the year 1215, the idea of individual human liberty had already been formulated. In the Magna Carta, wrested from King John at Runnymede, appears the following: "No free man shall be taken or imprisoned or dispossessed or outlawed or banished, or in any way destroyed, nor will we go upon him or upon him send except by the legal judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. To no one will we sell, to no one will we deny or delay rights or justice." Although a few attempts were made during the 16th century to better the conditions of the masses of the people, as all the institutions for the perpetuation of the slavery of the masses were firmly established, little was accomplished in this direction. That reforms move slowly is shown in the fact that as late as the beginning of the 19th century of the Christian era, the greater portion of the human race was in a state of bondage. Slavery existed in every quarter of the globe. In Russia, in 1855, there were 48 millions of serfs, and in Austria and Prussia the peasantry were nearly all slaves. In Hungary, 9 millions of human beings belonged to a subject class. Although no slaves were owned in England, slavery still existed in her colonies. In the West Indies the whip was freely used, and prior to the year 1820 no voice had been raised against the flogging of women on the plantations. In Scotland, down to the last year of the 18th century, colliers and salters were slaves and bound to their service for life, being bought and sold with the works at which they labored. Although America had put down the slave trade, she still owned slaves and continued to traffic in them until the year 1863. The history of legislation during the historic period shows that it has ever been in the interest of the rich against the poor, the strong against the weak. In France, at the beginning of the 19th century, liberty was extinct. The rich man could purchase for money the power to destroy those whom he hated. The law-makers of the age which we are considering were gentlemen, landowners, and as such were able to exercise their cupidity in a degree which precluded all idea of justice to the poorer classes. The abuses of government, the corn laws, the enormous tax on salt and on the various necessities of life show somewhat of the extent to which the poor were systematically robbed by the rich. The law passed in 1350 at Bannockburn, regulating the movements of the British working men, and which prohibited combinations among them, was in force until 1824. The evident object of this law was to repress the laborer and deprive him of his just earnings. Although this enactment was known to be oppressive, the working classes were not possessed of sufficient influence to cause its repeal. In England, women with their children worked in coal pits, and in the darkness, on hands and feet, dragged about wagons fastened to their waists by chains. Of this Mr. Mackenzie says, "Children of 6 were habitually employed. Their hours of labor were 14 to 16 daily. The horrors among which they lived induced disease and early death. Law did not seem to reach to the depths of a coal pit, and the hapless children were often mutilated and occasionally killed with perfect impunity by the brutalized miners among whom they labored. There was no machinery to drag the coals to the surface, and women climbed long wooden stairs with a basket of coal upon their backs. In the factories also, as late as 1832, children of 6 years of age worked from 13 to 15 hours daily. If they fell asleep, they were flogged. Sometimes, through exhaustion, they fell upon the machinery and were injured, possibly crushed, an occurrence which caused little concern to any except the mothers, who had learned to bear their pangs in silence. These children, who were stunted in size and disposed to various acute diseases, were also scrofulous and consumptive. In 1832, the recruiting surgeon could find no men to suit his purpose in the manufacturing districts. Throughout Europe, the prevailing idea concerning the management of criminals seems to have been vengeance. One would scarcely believe, except on trustworthy authority, that at the beginning of the 19th century the English criminal law recognized 223 capital offences. Indeed, so strong was the feeling in favor of severity that Edmund Burke said he could obtain the assent of the House of Commons to any law imposing the penalty of death. If one shot a rabbit, he was hanged. If he injured Westminster Bridge, he was hanged. If he appeared disguised on a public road, he was hanged, and so on. The hanging of small groups was a common occurrence, children of 10 years being sometimes among the condemned. A visit to the 5-sided tower in Nuremberg, in which are still preserved various instruments of human torture, will give an idea of the extreme cruelty practiced upon political offenders and heretics a century ago. The Holy Alliance of Austria, Prussia, and Russia, which was formed ostensibly to ensure peace and establish justice, but which in reality was entered into to suppress free speech, check the growing liberties of the people, and strengthen the belief in the divine right of kings, shows the obstacles which had to be overcome before any principle of justice and humanity could take root. The history of industrial and economic conditions since the beginning of the 18th century is largely the history of the common people. The change from the feudal system to that of the wage-earning regime may not, as far as the working class is concerned, be regarded as an unmixed blessing. Under feudalism, the lord of the soil was responsible for the maintenance and well-being of his vassals, while under the wage system the captains of industry assume no such responsibility. If the laborer chooses to accept the terms offered, well and good. If he refuses, he may starve. It is a matter of no concern to the employer, for are there not plenty of laborers who stand ready to take his place? That the laborer was no less a slave under the wage-earning system, than he had been under the feudalism is shown in the fact that under the first named as well as under the latter he had not the right of free contract. He must take what was offered him or starve. As is well known, the repression of the mental activities and the low physical condition which for more than 13 centuries had prevailed, prevented the seeds sown in the 16th century from taking root among the masses of the people. Their instincts were those of the slave, and 2 centuries were required to waken them from their lethargy. Finally, however, even among the class mentioned, the constructive forces began to assert themselves. Free thought, and to a certain extent free speech, were established. With the further development of liberal ideas, a belief in the divine right of kings and in the principles underlying monarchical institutions became somewhat weakened. A few attempts were even made to establish republics. Because of the glimmering light of scientific truth put forth in the 16th century, ecclesiastical authority was no longer supreme. Although many important steps had been taken to free men from the thraldom of the past, so firmly had the idea of woman's inferiority been established that no thought of including her in the new regime was ever entertained. Justice, equality, and liberty are subjects upon which man descants loudly and long. He talks glibly of his free institutions and even designates a number of his one-sided governments as republics, and these too notwithstanding the fact that women are still denied representation in the governments to which they owe allegiance, and that a large proportion of men are still within the grasp of economic slavery, all of which shows the extent to which the moral sense and the judgment have been dwarfed by prejudice and selfishness. Democracy is still a meaningless term, an ideal yet to be realized. At the beginning of the 19th century, such were the conditions surrounding women that an attempt on their part to extricate themselves from their legal and social bondage would have proved utterly futile. At that time women had practically no legal rights. Even the right to control their own bodies was denied them. As woman was dependent upon man for support, her sex functions were controlled by him, and the children which she bore belonged exclusively to him. He constituted the family. Wife and children did not count. To a considerable extent these conditions still prevail. Masculine law, masculine religion, and masculine ideas concerning the duties and uses of the female sex had made of woman a nondescript, a creature neither male nor female. Her mental constitution had become atrophied, the diluted reflections of men's opinions having been substituted for the natural feminine instincts and ideas. Among the great mass of women the original feminine type had disappeared. In process of time, however, women began slowly to awaken from the hideous nightmare which threatened to destroy the last remaining vestige of the instincts and ideas peculiar to the female constitution. In the beginning of the 19th century, some of the educational advantages enjoyed by men began to be appropriated by women. Thus began the unrest which now extends over the entire earth. About 70 years ago, a movement was started by women to secure for themselves the right to self-government. Immediately, all the prejudice which characterizes a sex aristocracy was aroused. Ridicule, calumny, and even personal abuse were directed against all those who were intelligent enough or fearless enough to stem the tide of popular indignation. For 40 years, little or no progress was made toward securing the right of self-government for women. As late as 1870, a woman who openly avowed herself a suffragist was regarded not only as bold and unwomanly, but as a dangerous person. The most strenuous opposition to the movement came from the clergy and the flocks over which they presided. Whenever church women were asked to consider the question of the equality of the sexes, their unvarying reply was, "My Bible forbids it." Now that the history of Pauline Christianity is better understood, its attitude toward the freedom of women needs no further explanation. When the then existing mental conditions are recalled, and especially when the religious prejudices of the time are considered, the attitude manifested toward the proposed enfranchisement of women is not perhaps remarkable. Although 40 years ago biological science was in its infancy, enough facts had at that time been discovered clearly to indicate the position which nature intended woman to occupy. By the scientists of that time, however, the logical and unavoidable inferences to be drawn from these facts were wholly ignored. During the ages of man's undisputed supremacy, so deeply rooted had the idea of woman's inferiority become, that these newly discovered facts concerning her development could not be accepted. The old prejudices could not at once be uprooted. We have already observed that whenever and wherever Mr. Darwin and other scientists of his time felt called upon to compare the relative importance of men and women, such comparison has invariably been to the disadvantage of the latter, and this, too, notwithstanding the fact that the evidence which they themselves have elaborated warrants no such conclusions. 40 years ago, the doctrine that woman has no independent existence, but that she is simply an appendage to man, was everywhere accepted and taught not only by ecclesiastics, but by scientists as well. Woman was only a rib taken from the side of man. None of the doctrines elaborated for the guidance of women was so explicit as those relating to the duties of wives. The cause for this is obvious. Earlier in this work the fact has been noted that our present form of marriage originated in force, that no other principle was involved in it than coercion on the one side and unwilling submission on the other. So long as the original idea underlying marriage is retained, or so long as woman is recognized as the property of her husband and subject to his control, no matter what may be achieved by individual women, the belief in the inferiority of women as a class will continue. In other words, so long as women remain economic slaves dependent upon their husbands for support, so long will their status remain unchanged. She is my goods, my chattels, my household stuff. There are in this country at the present time more than 9 millions of women engaged in earning their own livelihood. Many of these women have families dependent upon them for support. The disadvantages under which they labor are realized when we remember that their competitors are their political and economic superiors, and are therefore able to a considerable extent to dictate the conditions under which these women work. Yet, notwithstanding these unfavorable conditions, this change in woman's environment represents an important step in the evolutionary processes. By it, women are learning that only through independence is self-respect possible. We have already seen that whenever during the historic period women have had an opportunity to rise, they have never failed to rebel against the conditions imposed upon them. The women of Athens during the Periclean age, the Spartan women under Lycurgus, and the women of Rome during the time of the Antonine Caesars are notable examples of this fact. Even the Chinese women are claiming the right to govern themselves. In these later years they are unbinding their feet, and in other ways are defying the forces which in the past have prevented them from asserting their independence. The various examples of revolt among women have hitherto been carried on by single nations or by countries widely separated from one another. At the present time, however, the women of the entire world have risen to demand the freedom of their sex. However much those who favor the subjection of women may deplore this movement, even the most stupid among them will surely not fail to recognize its importance. The history of human society during the last 400 years has for the most part been a struggle between the constructive elements developed in human society and the destructive or disintegrating forces which are the result of the unchecked egoism or selfishness developed in man during the ages in which woman has been subject to his will. End of section 17. Section 18 of the Sexes in Science and History by Eliza Burt Gamble. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3. Early Historic Society. Chapter 7. Conclusion. Scientific investigation has proved the great age of the earth and the enormous length of time which has elapsed since the first appearance of human beings upon its surface. Concerning the career of man during the countless millions of years which followed his advent upon the earth, little is known down to a comparatively recent time, a time commonly designated as the historic period. When considering the past, one is inclined to ask the question, Does the history of mankind represent an unbroken line of progress? Or, on the contrary, does it reflect a series of alternating periods of development and decay? We have observed that in recent times, through the study of tribes and races, in the various stages of development, much has been learned concerning the origin of organized society and the development of human institutions. We have also seen that through the legends, traditions, and myths of the earliest historic peoples, much reliable information has been gained regarding the conditions which prevailed at a still earlier period of human existence. Notwithstanding the proofs which in recent times have been obtained relative to the law of periodicity which has thus far regulated human progress, the idea prevails that in our own time mental activity has reached a stage never before witnessed. It is assumed that throughout the entire history of mankind, material and intellectual development has never attained to such colossal proportions. It is evident that our egoism has obscured our normal vision. We lack perspective. There is no evidence to prove that the present brain capacity of human beings exceeds that of the earliest ages of human history, neither is there any proof that the moral sense has been in the least reinforced. The lofty moral and spiritual precepts which abound in the Upanishads have never been surpassed, possibly never equaled. We are heirs of all the ages. The accumulated knowledge of the past is responsible for present achievements. Those who have made a study of tribes and races in the various stages of development find much evidence going to prove that extant savage tribes do not represent man as he first emerged from the animal type, but, on the contrary, that they are the degenerate descendants of an extinct civilized race, differing little from our own. If this be true, if human development, which thus far seems to have been wholly material, contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction, would it not be wise for the present generation to examine existing conditions in order to ascertain if we too have not already entered upon the path of degeneracy or decay? Possibly this will be regarded as a pessimistic suggestion, but, as has already been observed, a comparison between the conditions existing in prehistoric times and those which prevail under the present so-called civilized regime fully justifies this suggestion. Those persons who have acquainted themselves with the available facts underlying the growth of organized society and the development of existing institutions, and who have coordinated these facts with the present situation, are able to trace not only the growth of the destructive principle in human affairs, but are able to forecast with a considerable degree of accuracy the results which must inevitably follow. Without a knowledge of the past, it is impossible to understand or interpret the present. We are living in a remarkable age. It is to be doubted if throughout the entire historic period there has been a time when passing events moved so swiftly or when they assumed the magnitude of those now taking place. Causes which were set up during prehistoric times have reached a climax. The inevitable results from those causes are upon us. In order to compare the past and the present, it becomes necessary briefly to recall some of the already recorded facts relative to existing conditions under early organized society. When human beings lived closer to nature and before the natural checks to the lower or disintegrating forces had been withdrawn, the basic principles underlying human action were equality and liberty. No member of a communal group could claim any right or privilege not enjoyed by all. There was no poverty and no crime. Disease as we know it was unknown. As the lands were held in common, women were absolutely free and independent. They chose their mates and were responsible for the well-being of their offspring. As women controlled the sexual relation and themselves regulated prenatal conditions, the children inherited strong bodies and healthy minds. Dissensions over property did not occur, and jealousy and a desire for personal aggrandizement had not been developed. The religious worship of primitive people consisted for the most part in invocations to the Great Mother, the fructifying principle throughout nature, from whom were derived all earthly benefits. Later, the Great Mother came to be worshipped under various appellations, namely Cybele or Astarte in Asia Minor, Athena in Greece, Minerva in Rome, and Isis or Neith in Egypt. Finally, as is well known, These goddesses were dethroned by an all-powerful male god, an anthropomorphic deity whose chief attribute was virile might. This change in the god idea was coincident with and dependent upon a corresponding change in the relations of the sexes which took place at a certain period in human history. The god idea is now and ever has been in strict accord with the existing conceptions concerning the relative importance of the sex functions in human beings. During thousands of years of life on earth, the mother was the only recognized parent. As the giver of life and the protector of offspring, she was regarded as the creator and preserver of the race. She represented the constructive element in human society. Later, however, when man began to contest the supremacy of woman, her hitherto unquestioned prerogatives began to be claimed by him. It was at this juncture in human affairs that the contention arose over the relative importance of the sexes in the processes of reproduction. Not only in the traditions and legends of early historic peoples, but in their histories as well, there is much evidence given to prove that this contention was as fierce as that which at the present time is going on between the sexes. As a result of this contention, both female and male gods were worshipped. Those who recognized the mother as the giver of life continued to worship the female principle, while those who accepted the new doctrine enunciated by Apollo, namely that the soul of the child is derived from the father and the mother is only a nurse to his heaven-born offspring, accepted the new religion. When the dominion of man over woman was complete, the female principle throughout nature and in the god idea was practically unrecognized or wholly ignored. Throughout the history period, male power has been supreme not only on the earth but also in heaven. Classical history is not wanting in references to this change in the relations of the sexes and in the god idea which took place at a certain stage of human development. We are informed that in Greece, probably about 1100 years BC, Cecrops instituted marriage and established a new religion. The new religion instituted by Cecrops was the doctrine that the father is the only parent, that the soul of the child is derived from him, and that the mother performs simply the office of nurse to his offspring. Woman was no longer the creator or giver of life. She was matter, while man, who was henceforth to be her lord and master, was spirit. Marriage, as instituted by Cecrops, was the natural and inevitable outcome of the new religion. It was the first attempt of the Greek tribes to legalize and control the sex functions of women. The deeper one delves into the mysteries of the past, the more apparent does it become that the sexual degradation of women is deeply rooted in religion. For untold ages, early organized society proceeded along the line of uninterrupted evolutionary progress. Although humanity was traversing an unknown path, the arts of life steadily increased. The production of farinaceous food, by means of which an exclusive meat diet was avoided, was an achievement of the utmost importance to the race. The idea of government, which at first included only the members of related groups, was extended to the tribe and even to the nation. Equality, freedom, and justice constituted the fundamental principles of early organized society. Finally, however, through causes which have already been set forth in these pages, this system gradually gave place to a regime founded on selfishness or egoism. At this time in human affairs, related groups could no longer defend themselves against the aggressions of powerful hostile foes. Jealousies arose, and alien tribes began to make war upon one another, the stronger appropriating the lands of the weaker and making slaves of the people. The women of the subjugated groups became the sexual slaves of the conquerors. As native women were free, foreign women who could be controlled were greatly in demand. Therefore, frequent attacks were made on foreign groups for the sole purpose of carrying off the women. The lands which had been held in common by all the members of the tribe were now parcelled out among individual chieftains. The prestige given to these lords of the soil, and the advantage gained by them through the control of the natural resources and the means of subsistence, soon gave rise to a privileged class, a class which in process of time became masters of the masses of the people. When wars for conquest and spoliation became general, and when the communal system under which the principles of liberty and equality had been established gave place to a system founded on force, the entire habitable globe became a battleground upon which each and every individual struggled fiercely with every other individual, not only for place and power, but for the means of subsistence as well. When the principles of democracy established under Gentile institutions gave place to a system of governmental control under which only the rights of the few were recognized, and when the unchecked disruptive forces had gained the ascendancy over the constructive elements developed in human nature, the degeneracy of the race began. It is not difficult to trace the steps by which this degeneracy has been accomplished. Although we of the present boast of our material achievements, and although we arrogate to ourselves the most remarkable degree of intelligence, enlightenment, and even culture, it is evident that we have not risen above a plane of the grossest materialism, and that in the truly human qualities, those which distinguish man from the animal, we are sadly deficient. That in these later days the moral sense has become atrophied is shown in the fact that our present tooth and claw system, under which each individual must array himself against every other individual in the struggle for existence, is regarded as a practical exemplification of the principle of the survival of the fittest. According to this interpretation, not those who are best endowed, physically, mentally, and morally, are the fittest to survive, but on the contrary, those who are best able to appropriate to themselves the opportunities and advantages which belong to others. In other words, it is claimed that by the survival of the fittest is meant the survival of those who, because of their material advantages, are able to exploit their fellow men. A few of the processes involved in the control of the many by the few have already been mentioned. To maintain the authority of the privileged class and to strengthen their hold on the liberties of the people, monarchy, aristocracy, and ecclesiasticism were established, and the divine right of kings proclaimed. Entrenched behind these mighty bulwarks, the position of the usurpers has been impregnable. Through enforced ignorance and superstition, the common people came to regard their situation not only as natural and unavoidable, but as representing the will of the Almighty. If they were faithful to their masters in this world, in the world to come they would be furnished with free transport to fields Elysian. Strange to relate, this belief still prevails. At the present time, the principle of human freedom is still struggling for recognition, but the great mass of human beings, although boasting of their civilization and enlightenment, continue to uphold the principle that the few should rule the many. They regard their rulers as superior beings whose authority may not be questioned. At the present time we have before us the dismal spectacle of half a dozen hereditary monarchs who, with their satellites, claim the right to rule over nearly the whole of Europe and a large portion of Asia. 25 millions of men are now engaged in a deadly conflict to further the commercial and territorial interests of their masters. When we compare present conditions with those which existed under early organized society at a time when every individual member of a group was equal in responsibility and power with every other member of the same group, we are enabled to perceive the path which mankind has taken on its onward course. When one reflects on the peculiar trend of human development, one may feel no surprise over the fact that at this juncture in human affairs there should arise a ruler in whom the desire for world dominion is clearly apparent. That such a potentate has already appeared is shown in the following from Emperor William II of Germany. On me, as Germany's emperor, the Spirit of God has descended. I am his weapon, his sword, his vicegerent. Woe unto the disobedient, death to the unbeliever. Here it is observed that this ruler aspires not only to earthly dominion, but also to divine recognition. To strangle the growing principles of liberty and to establish a system founded on force, under which the individual was to become only an instrument to do the bidding of his lord and master, was doubtless the original object of those who instigated the present war. During the ages since the establishment of the authority of the few over the many, the latter until a comparatively recent time have offered little resistance to the tyranny exercised over them. Mentally dwarfed, the proletariat have not yet reached the degree of intelligence necessary for a combination of interests. They have therefore remained like dumb-driven cattle, subject only to the will of their masters. About 60 years ago, Through the efforts of a few leaders who had begun to realize the situation, a certain degree of unrest began to manifest itself among them, and 40 years later the proletariat succeeded in establishing an international organization ostensibly for their own benefit as opposed to the interests of the ruling class. They, however, lacked solidarity. The natural tendency of their sex towards separateness or disintegration was not easily overcome. This is shown in the case of the present European conflict. When the war broke out, instead of standing together, they at once hastened to obey the mandates of their respective rulers, and with no higher idea than patriotism or nationality, they at once began their brutal assault upon one another. It was evident from the beginning that the German socialists, they who had been the most conspicuous in the international movement, were first, last, and all the time Germans, and that after all they were actuated only by one desire, namely national aggrandizement. So lacking are men in the principle of solidarity, and so deeply rooted within them is the idea of separateness, that it is to be doubted if, without the aid of woman, they will ever be able to free themselves from the tyranny of the past. In very recent times a foe has arisen which threatens to be a greater menace to the liberties of the masses of the people than were the foes by which they were originally enslaved. I refer to the money power, or plutocracy. During the last few years, through the application of scientific methods to industry, and through mechanical inventions by means of which the power and efficiency of labor have been greatly increased, the accumulation of wealth has reached a point never before witnessed in the history of the world. Yet, strange to relate, along with this enormous increase in wealth, there has been a corresponding increase in poverty and crime. This immense wealth has not been shared by those who produced it, but has gone into the pockets of those who exploit labor for profits. Along with this enormous increase in wealth is observed a general lowering of standards both in private and public life. There are in this country alone 10 millions of people who are deprived of the necessary food, clothing, and shelter to ensure a healthful existence. In the public schools of New York City, it is reported that 600,000 children are victims of malnutrition. In winter, thousands of hungry men and women go up and down the streets of our large cities begging for an opportunity to earn a living. Our jails and prisons are filled to overflowing. Our almshouses and insane asylums are insufficient to meet the demands. Imbecility and other forms of mental degeneracy are increasing at an alarming rate. Epilepsy and other congenital diseases prevail among all classes and conditions of the people. 5/6 of the children born are diseased at birth. The basic principle underlying our present economic system is profits. To secure large profits, labor must be cheap and plentiful, and that labor may be cheap and plentiful, an enormous population must be produced. In order to produce this enormous population, women must be enslaved. Although existing conditions are such as to make life a curse instead of a blessing, the cry for babies, more babies, is heard on every hand, and this notwithstanding the fact that a large proportion of the children born die before the age of 5, because this environment is unfavorable to life. The clamor for an ever-increasing birth rate never ceases. It is believed that Providence alone is responsible for human ills. Poverty and disease are accepted as natural and unavoidable evils. The fears expressed lest the human race fail to perpetuate itself would be pathetic were the reason for these fears less obvious. When we reflect that the labor market must be constantly supplied with cheap labor, and that millions of soldiers must be produced to protect the commercial and territorial interests of the ruling class, the true inwardness of this insatiate cry for constantly increasing numbers is revealed. Ecclesiasticism, the faithful ally of plutocracy, mindful of the fact that its strength lies in an excess of numbers, has ever jealously guarded the injunction to increase and multiply. No doctrine of the so-called Christian Church has been so fondly cherished and so faithfully preserved as has that of the subjection of women. Woman's glorification under the Christian system has been exactly commensurate with her obedience to man. No offering from her to the Almighty is so acceptable as unrestrained reproductive energy. The report of a declining birth rate in any country of the globe is a signal for instant alarm, but although publicists and politicians have attempted to control the birth rate not only by threats and promises, but by legal enactments regulating marriage, still it is observed that in all countries of Europe, with the exception of Ireland, Bulgaria, and Romania, the birth rate during the last 25 years has steadily declined. Although numberless causes have been suggested to account for this phenomenon, and although various remedies have been proposed to lessen this evil, the actual cause underlying the declining birth rate over time remains unrecognized. Politicians, publicists, and ecclesiastics all refuse to acknowledge the obvious fact that the increasing economic independence of women is alone responsible for this phenomenon. Notwithstanding the fact that during the last 25 years marked progress is observed in the social and economic conditions of women, still the sexual position of the great mass of women has steadily declined. The fact that so far as her sex relations are concerned, civilized woman occupies a lower position than that occupied by the female animal has already been noted in these pages. The traffic in women is carried on in every country on the earth. The existing sexual conditions are the direct result of the overstimulation of the disruptive characters inherited by man from his male progenitors among the lower orders of life, characters which, among animals, have been checked by the constructive forces developed in the female. Our sexual conditions and our present economic and industrial situation loudly proclaim the degeneracy of our time. When the principles of equality and liberty, which were established by early organized society, gave place to a system founded on force and the control of the many by the few, and when through the subjection of women the natural checks to the disruptive tendencies developed in the male were withdrawn, the conditions now existing in so-called civilized society were foreshadowed. A crisis has been reached in human affairs. The old regime has run its course and is about to disappear. A new era is about to dawn on the human race. The war which is now devastating Europe, and which will doubtless spread over the entire earth, is the beginning of the end. The effects of the causes which were set up in prehistoric times have reached their full measure of development, and can no more be postponed or averted than can the thunderbolt which follows an electrical explosion. A thoroughly material civilization founded on selfishness and sensuality must be destroyed root and branch before the higher planes of activity for which humanity is destined may be reached. The present conflict, therefore, should not be regarded simply as a horrible calamity, but as a necessary preliminary to these higher conditions. If the birth of the new regime can come only through blood and tears, if only through the throes of war is deliverance possible, then it is not only unwise, but useless to bewail the present crisis. Through the cleansing process involved in the present revolution, humanity will doubtless return to the legitimate path of evolutionary development. Either liberty and justice, the cardinal principles underlying early organized society, will be re-established, or the processes of disruption will complete the work of degeneration now so well under way. In the transformation which is to take place, it is not likely that a vestige of the institutions which have produced the present regime will remain. The conflict now going on between the higher and lower forces developed in human life represents the struggle of omnipotent life for higher expression in matter. It has been shown in this work that during the development of life on the earth two forces have been steadily at work, the one a conserving, cohesive element, the other a disruptive, disintegrating energy. The one tends toward combination or solidarity, the other toward separateness or individual sufficiency. The one is constructive, the other destructive. Had the constructive processes in human society been allowed their legitimate expression, the scenes now being enacted in Europe would have been impossible. The principal force which has been employed in the development of our present civilization has been male energy. In the past, this enormous force has been necessary to subdue the earth and make of it a suitable habitation for civilized humanity. In later times, however, the discovery of hitherto unknown forces in nature, the application of scientific methods to industry, and the invention of mechanical devices for the lessening of human toil have done away with the necessity for an excess of human brawn. In other words, the excessive male energy which has in the past been required for the development of our present civilization has become not only useless, but an actual hindrance to further progress. As this enormous power is no longer needed for useful purposes, it has been turned into channels of wantonness and destruction. It has become disruptive and dangerous to a degree which may be appreciated when we reflect on the present conditions not only in Europe, but over the entire earth. Among the cleansing processes involved in the present crisis is the elimination of a considerable number of the useless elements described above, elements which, being no longer necessary for the maintenance of the common good, have become a menace to society. According to our narrow human conceptions, by which passing events are regarded only in relation to their present effects, the eliminating processes now going on are cruel and inhuman. Nature, however, pays little heed to human suffering, but although she ignores human misery, she will nevertheless demand an exact accounting for the deeds of selfishness and ignorance which are responsible for the present disorder. She will inaugurate no scheme of salvation. No vicarious atonement will be provided to save mankind from the consequences of their own folly. The struggle now going on in nearly every quarter of the globe marks the beginning of the eliminating process. The useless elements in human society are wearing themselves out, destroying themselves by their own rashness and folly, impelled by a desire which they do not understand and which they are unable to resist. These victims of a decaying civilization rush madly on to destruction. Those men who voluntarily seek war represent a dissatisfied or discontented class. True to the primitive instincts of the race, they crave the peculiar excitement which war brings. It is not unlikely that many of them understand instinctively that something is wrong with the present regime, but they seem not to be able to analyze the situation. Doubtless, very many of those engaged in the present European struggle are actuated by patriotism. They want to maintain the existing territorial boundaries presided over by their respective rulers. They desire also to retain the institutions, social, political, economic, and religious, which have grown up under a system where the few control the many. Evidently, the idea of human liberty has not yet dawned upon them. If universal freedom awaits the birth of the new regime, which is being heralded by the present upheaval, then it is plain that the men in the trenches are quite unmindful of the significance of the conflict in which they are engaged. The belligerent countries of Europe may consent to a truce, and there may be a lull in the universal unrest, but there will be no genuine peace until the principles of human liberty has been established on a firm and lasting basis. That the removal of these superfluous men from their usual vocations will not materially interfere with the useful industries of Europe is shown in the fact that although 25 million of them have been called to the war, their withdrawal from the industrial field has not greatly disturbed the industrial situation, and this too notwithstanding the fact that many new occupations have been created by the war. The work formerly done by these men has been largely taken up by women. It should be borne in mind that under the new conditions which are approaching, the constructive element developed in human society is again to assume command over the destructive forces which have been in control since the beginning of the historic period. As this element has been confined to women, and as it is by them transmitted to offspring, it is not difficult to forecast the position which the women of the future will occupy. The institution of marriage as it now exists will disappear. Only the most robust among women will propagate the race. These women, as did the women under early organized society, will choose their mates. They will exercise absolute control over the sex functions. Thus will be avoided the terrible consequences which have resulted from the present form of marriage. The numerical preponderance of women over men under the new regime is probable. Nor will the devastating processes of war be wholly responsible for this condition. Science informs us that, not only among the lower orders of life, but among human beings as well, certain conditions of nutrition produce more females than males. The more nutritious and wholesome the food, the greater the excess of females over males. Under higher conditions, when the laws of health and life are better understood, and especially when the subject of proper nutrition has received the attention which its importance deserves, it is not unreasonable to suppose that the excess of female births over those of males will be considerable. Although there have doubtless been long lapses of time during which the human race has seemed to go backward, it is believed that the trend of humanity is now and ever has been upward. If, as is believed, human events move in cycles, if the civilizations which have risen in the past represent a spiral, each of these civilizations reaching a higher stage of development than its predecessor, then it may be inferred that the era which is now dawning will surpass in grandeur anything which the world has ever witnessed. If, as many persons believe, a stage of development has been reached in which human beings are to be endowed with a sixth sense, if the intuitive faculties which are closely allied to the constructive element and which mark a still greater distinction between man and the animal are to come into play, it may be assumed that the mental and spiritual faculties will reach a stage of development scarcely dreamed of in our own time. Humanity will have come into its own. The animal in man will have been left behind. The coordination of science and history not only illumines the past and explains the present, but the inevitable results of the natural sequence of events point unerringly to the conditions which must prevail in the future. The philosophy of history proves to the earnest seeker after truth that the door of the future is not wholly closed. End of section 18. End of The Sexes in Science and History by Eliza Burt Gamble.